Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bill of Rights Institute AP Government Content Review webinar. We're so happy to have you here tonight as we help you prepare for the upcoming AP Government and Politics test. Tonight's webinar is going to focus on the executive branch and the bureaucratic agencies. I'm your BRI host, Liz Evans. I'm the Regional Programs Manager here at BRI, and I taught AP Gov for 6 years, so I will be manning the chat and answering as many questions as I can. Joining me tonight is a very familiar face, Paul Sargent from Hershey, Pennsylvania, who has taught AP Government for 15 years. We're so happy to have him back this year to lead our review sessions. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Paul.
All right, thanks a lot, Liz. Well, welcome everybody. Today we are going to continue our journey through Unit 2 here, hoping to prepare you guys for the AP Gov exam. Today we're going to go over the executive branch and the bureaucracy. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get things started right up for you guys. All right. So as I said, we're going to start off with the executive branch and the bureaucracy today. This is session 3. There are 9 total sessions in our series here. So hopefully you've been tuning in and you'll continue to tune in as we get you ready for this AP Gov exam. All right, so I always like to start off with the big idea, and this comes straight from the College Board. I think it's important that you see how they phrase things. This is the same big idea that we tackled yesterday, and we'll tackle it again tomorrow night. So it says, because power is widely distributed and checks prevent one branch from usurping powers from the others, institutional actors are in the position where they must both compete and cooperate in order to govern. And so yesterday we talked about, and we'll continue to talk about tonight, a lot about power being distributed between the 3 branches of government and the whole idea of one branch trying to usurp powers from another branch. We'll talk a lot today about checks and balances and how to prevent that usurpation of power. And it's important to understand the competition and cooperation part of this. In order to govern, people need to compete and cooperate in order to do this effectively. Sometimes competition is good, it comes out with good outcomes, but obviously cooperation is a nice place to end up. So today we're going to start off with Enduring Understanding 2.1. The presidency has been enhanced beyond its expressed constitutional powers. And while it's pretty simple here and straightforward, it is important to see that this is all about the expansion of presidential powers. And in a separation of powers system, if one branch of government's powers expand, then it's necessarily at the expense of other branches of government. And so what we're really going to tell the story of today is kind of how the modern presidency has changed from basically an executive kind of clerical kind of job into sort of the leader of the free world and the fairly unquestioned head of our government. And you know, it's really sort of pushing beyond those constitutional powers that are important. So a little bit about the job here. We have newly elected President Joe Biden standing here with his official presidential portrait. Presidents are elected for 4-year terms. And so President Biden, having been elected in 2020, is up for re-election in 2024. Now, they are limited to 2 terms in office. This is a result of the 22nd Amendment. It was a reaction by Congress and the states to the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected to 4 terms. And you know, when you have a president who's elected to 4 terms, questions start arising about, you know, dictatorial powers and authoritarianism, and you know, maybe even the creation of some sort of like monarchy or something like that. Not that Roosevelt was a monarch, but you get the idea. People get a little bit nervous. And so they got a little bit nervous and they said this presidency is limited to 2 terms. This is the only office in the federal government, by the way, which has term limits to it. So congressmen, senators, judges, they don't have term limits, but presidents do. All right. Now, we're going to go through the eligibility here, and the eligibility that's put out in the Constitution is presidents must be at least 35 years old when they take office. They must be a natural born citizen. So this is again, the only office in the federal government where person cannot be a naturalized citizen in order to serve. In Congress, in the judicial branch, people can move to the United States, they can become US citizens, and then they can serve as representatives and senators and judges and all that kind of stuff. But the president must be a natural born citizen, someone born in the United States or born to American parents. And the president must have lived in the US for 14 years prior to taking office. And, the founders put that in there to ensure that the president had ties to the nation and wasn't living abroad somewhere and then coming to sweep in and sort of take over this executive job. Now, when we talk about expanding presidential power, we really talk about two different things. We talk about formal powers and we talk about informal powers. So formal powers, very simply, are those powers which are laid out in the Constitution. They're delegated to the president by the Constitution itself. Informal powers are ways that presidents have found in order to get things done without necessarily following the sometimes clunky and sometimes difficult constitutional avenues of doing things. So what we have here is we have President Abraham Lincoln sitting down with General George McClellan after, I believe this was after the Battle of Gettysburg, maybe it was Antietam, it was one of the two, and talking to him about military strategy. And this is a formal power of the President of the United States. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, and so can directly take control of command. Now, one of the most important powers that presidents have is the power of the veto. And the veto allows a president to stop a bill from becoming a law. It is part of the final process. Congress will pass a bill with both houses of Congress. It then gets sent to the president. The president can choose just to say no to that thing. Now, presidents also have the option of doing what's called a pocket veto. Now, while the veto is a formal power, the pocket veto is an informal power. See, what happens is the Constitution lays out that if the president doesn't sign the bill within 10 days of receiving it from Congress, then the bill goes back to Congress and Congress can pass it into law without the signature of the president. However, Congress goes on recess every now and then. They go on recess for Christmas time. They go on recess in the spring. They take a summer break. They're on recess every so often. And if there's no Congress in session in order to receive an unsigned bill, then the bill simply dies. Now, why would someone use a pocket veto? Well, maybe it's some kind of bill that a president doesn't want to sign, but also doesn't want the bad press from vetoing it. That's going to go into the papers and onto the news, and they're going to say President vetoed this, which is a very strong statement. And just to sort of let it die is less engaging, I guess. Now, there is a thing called the line item veto. Now, this is something that all governors, or I should say most governors, have in the United States. Under a line item veto, an executive can go through and nullify parts of bills. In other words, think of a spending bill, which is laying out all kinds of different things the federal government wants to spend money on. Well, under a line item veto, a president could go through and say, well, I'm going to sign this whole bill, but I don't want to spend $2 billion on this, and I don't want to spend $1.5 billion on it. They basically just mark it out, and it effectively takes that part out of the law. Well, Congress gave this power, or at least recognized this power, with Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton used it in a spending bill and was sued by New York. And in this lawsuit, the Supreme Court found that the line item veto is not a constitutional power of the president. So it's not that it's informal, it's just that it's unconstitutional. It's in direct violation of what the president can do. The president in foreign policy really tends to act sort of as the lead actor in all of our foreign policy. Presidents are, of course, the commander-in-chief. They head the military. Now, I touched on this last night, but let me just take a moment and talk about the military powers. Because according to the Constitution, the Senate is responsible for declaring war against a country. And then the president, as commander-in-chief, is in charge of using the military to fight a war. However, what we found in the 20th century, using somewhat formal powers, but using them informally, is that presidents have gone around the need for a declaration of war simply by sending troops to fight places and not having a formal declaration. We haven't formally declared war on anyone since World War II. So the commander-in-chief power is very, very powerful. President is also the chief diplomat, really is in charge of conducting foreign relations, deciding how to interact with other countries, deciding which countries to recognize, which countries to speak with and receive as visitors, those sorts of things. Lots of this is done through the ambassador corps, which is part of the bureaucracy that we'll talk about later. But the president heads up those efforts. President can, as the chief diplomat, negotiate treaties, again, usually done by people who work for the president, but occasionally, as with Woodrow Wilson, done by the president himself. But the problem with treaties, and Woodrow Wilson found this out, is that once they're agreed upon, they have to be taken back to the Senate, and the Senate has to ratify them. That's part of that checks and balances thing that the Constitution lays out. So modern presidents have found it more convenient to engage in what are called executive agreements. These are informal. This is an informal presidential power. And in an executive agreement, rather than signing a formal treaty that has to be ratified, two national leaders or multiple national leaders sign an informal agreement to do basically the same things. It can hold the weight of a treaty in that it's going to guide the way the government approaches foreign relations with another country, but it doesn't have to pass the Senate and be ratified. That's good. The downside is that the next president doesn't have to live up to the executive agreement. So they can go away as quickly as they are made. So easy to do, easy to get rid of. Treaties, difficult to do, but also difficult to get rid of. Presidents, though, really get most of their power through bargaining and persuasion. Because of the way policymaking is made up, the president needs Congress on his side in order to get things done. And so really, it's a matter of trying to get what the president wants by convincing Congress to act the way the president wants them to. Now, one of the powers which has been used a lot in the last 40, 50 years has been executive orders. And executive orders they have the weight of law. Again, this is an informal power. See, in the Constitution, as I've said, Congress has to pass a law in both houses of Congress, and then the president will sign it in order for it to become a law. But presidents have found that they can deliver directions to the federal bureaucracy to tell them how to do certain things. And when they tell them how to do certain things, those things have the force of law. So these are not laws, but they are directions to the federal bureaucracy about how to implement laws, how to go through and make things happen. So a good example of this, when Barack Obama was president of the United States, he created an executive order which created the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which basically said that for about, I think it was 2 million undocumented immigrants who arrived to the United States as children, they were not given amnesty, they were not given citizenship. Those sorts of things would require laws, but Barack Obama directed the federal government agencies responsible for deportation not to go after these people and deport them. Now, it doesn't mean that they're legal, but it does mean that on a daily life thing, it works kind of the same. Not completely the same, but kind of the same. They don't worry about deportation. All right. And so what they really do is executive orders have the effect of laws without going through the lawmaking process. So what you can see is these informal powers the presidents use kind of circumvent the constitutional process in order to make things a little bit easier and quicker. It's really nice to have a bunch of signing ceremonies for executive orders because it looks like a president is really doing a lot. However, just like executive agreements. Understand executive orders, while easy to create, are also easy to remove. And President Biden, when he came to office, spent the first few days in office simply getting rid of lots of executive orders that President Trump created while he was in office. So easy come, easy go kind of thing. Now, some presidents also make use of things called signing statements. And these, I'm just going to touch on these real quickly because they are a little strange. Signing statements are effectively little extra things that presidents might add to the end of a bill, talking about how it might be implemented or something like that. There's no real constitutional basis for a signing statement, but a president signing on the bottom of a bill, yes, this is going into effect. However, I will choose not to implement this if I don't want to, is going to have some severe repercussions for how the law is going to be carried out. Presidents also have the power of appointment. There are lots of official jobs, which are appointment jobs. And so the president is in charge of finding individuals for those jobs and appointing them to it. This includes cabinet members, the direct advisors to the president of the United States and heads of cabinet departments. It includes ambassadors, which conduct foreign relations with lots of other countries around the world. This includes the White House staff, people who work for the president in the White House, writing his speeches and setting his appointments and speaking to people who want to talk to the president, whatever, advising him on things. But the longest lasting influence that presidents have through the appointment power is perhaps the longest lasting influence presidents have in any of their powers, and that's judicial appointments. Now, President Trump had appointed, I believe, over 300 judges to the federal bench at some level, whether it's Supreme Court, where he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, but also at different levels of the court system. And the reason they're the longest lasting influence is because those federal judges serve life terms. So 30 years from now, it's certainly possible that some 300 judges that were appointed by President Trump are still working on a daily basis in the federal judicial system. So that's why this can be a long-lasting influence. Now, for all of these appointments, it is important to know that the Senate confirms these. Now, there is a way to get around these somewhat, an informal power to not need Senate confirmation. And that's President Trump did this quite a bit, to appoint not heads of departments, but interim heads of departments. So, here's someone, we're not really giving him the job. He doesn't need to be confirmed by the Senate, but he's going to sit in the seat and he's going to do the job while we look for someone who's going to be permanent. So that certainly is a way of getting around this. Now, one of the foundational documents that you're going to need to be familiar with is Federalist 70. And in Federalist 70, let's see, do I have it? No, I don't have another slide about this. So Federalist 70 is the justification for the single executive. See, the founding fathers had talked about lots of different ways to do this. And coming out of a monarchical system where they really weren't happy with having the king, some founders were really worried about having one president, thinking it was really setting this person up for, to be perhaps a new monarch. And they called for, maybe having 2 presidents at the same time. There were lots of different proposals. But in Federalist 70, the argument is made that the system of checks and balances really is going to rein in the president. Presidents can't become authoritarian with those kinds of checks and balances around them. Now, the changing roles of the president certainly have increased over the last 100 years. And as you've seen with executive agreements, executive orders, signing statements, interim appointments, all those things have served the presidency by taking on more power that the president can do. The president, again, is limited in his term by the 22nd Amendment for a total of 10 years. A president, by the way, can serve 2 years of his predecessor's term before coming into 2 terms in office of his own. And really, what all of these changing powers have done is they've really fed a debate about how expansive the power of the presidency is. Does today's president wield too much power? Is today's presidency something that the founding fathers would have recognized, or is it something that they really would have feared? Barack Obama, for example, when he was faced with a hostile Congress that was not passing bills that he wanted to see passed, simply turned to executive orders as a way of getting around that. And the argument goes that if you have if you have the ability of a president to circumvent checks and balances, then you have essentially an unchecked executive. You have someone who does not have to does not have to work with other branches of government in order to get things done, and that can be dangerous. Now, the role of technology has obviously, as with everything else in the world, changed how the presidency works, and largely in the form of communication. I mean, if we go back really before the 1920s, we don't have any widespread use of radio, and so presidents had a very hard time communicating with the people. It would be done through the newspaper or something like that. But then along came radio, and along came Franklin Roosevelt, who started using his infamous fireside chats in order to communicate directly with the people and tell them about what he was doing and his government was doing to fight the Great Depression. But modern technology has also enhanced the ability of presidents to communicate. Television, for example, has made it so that presidents can address the nation directly. And of course, social media has changed the ball game completely, because what it does is it gives a president rapid response capability. With modern communication, think Twitter, for example, presidents have the ability to almost instantaneously comment on anything that happens, and thus reach millions of people who they might otherwise have a more difficult time reaching. And so they almost just have a complete bullhorn that allows them to address America, you know. One of the things that still holds out, though, and it is a constitutional provision, is the State of the Union address. And this is where the President of the United States will address both houses of Congress and the American people these days and lay out for them a legislative agenda for the coming year. Here's where we are. Here's what we need to work on. Here's where we'd like to be in a year. And it is a very widely followed and covered by the press type of speech. Now, what all this amounts to is what's called the bully pulpit. See, what happens with the president is they get a lot of media attention, and they get a lot of attention from American voters because it's the president. There's only one. 435 representatives in the House don't garner that kind of attention. 100 senators in the Senate don't garner that kind of attention. There's one president. And so that president has a unique ability to speak to the American people and to drive opinions. And presidents who are very good at communicating directly with people, like President Trump was, are going to have enormous influence on how the voters feel and what the voters do. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to public opinion in a few days. So what about those checks and balances that exist against the president? Well, here are just a few to keep in mind. So if you're thinking about checks on presidential power, think about this. Number one, Congress can override a presidential veto. Now, it's not easy. It takes a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, which is exceptionally difficult to get, but it does happen. And it actually happens more than you'd think. So Congress can override a presidential veto if it comes down. Senate also has those as advise and consent powers, ratifying treaties, confirming appointments to those federal positions, those sorts of things that the Senate has to do. The president can't get those done without the Senate's approval. There's also impeachment power, which used to not be really something that was done. I mean, if you think about prior to the 1990s, we had only had one president ever be impeached, Andrew Johnson, in the wake of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. But in the late 1990s, Bill Clinton got impeached, and then twice in this past administration, President Trump got impeached. Now, understand that impeachment does not mean removal from office. Those are two different things. And so an impeachment proceedings, and I feel like I don't need to talk about this as much as I have in the past. I mean, you guys have certainly seen this even while you were taking this class. So the House of Representatives impeaches a president, which is basically bringing up charges against a president, and then the Senate sits as a jury, really, and decides whether those charges mean that the president should be removed from office. And of the 4 impeachments we've had in American history, not a single president has been removed from office after being impeached. The courts can also get into the fray here, providing checks on the presidency by blocking executive orders or finding executive orders to be unconstitutional. So while they're not formal pieces of legislation, actions by the president can be found unconstitutional by the court system, and they can stop them from happening. Most commonly, though, what happens when presidents find it difficult to enact some of their ideas is because of bureaucratic inaction. Bureaucrats, that we'll talk about a little bit later today, are charged with enacting and implementing federal law. And if they choose simply not to do it very fast or not really to do it at all, then whatever that law is loses its teeth and loses its impact almost completely. So speaking of the federal bureaucracy, let's go ahead and dive in and see what we can do, see what we can figure out about this. So here's an enduring understanding from the College Board itself. The federal bureaucracy is a powerful institution implementing federal policies with sometimes questionable accountability. And I want to draw attention to that accountability part, because that's the thing which drives all kinds of conversations year after year after year after year with the bureaucracy. Now, you see the bureaucracy even if you walk around Washington, D.C., because you'll walk past buildings that have these nice big signs telling you exactly who's in there. This is the 23rd Street entrance for the Department of State. So no question, this is the State Department here. This is a cabinet department that runs all of the foreign relations with other countries. So I've always found that my students have a hard time getting their head around what a bureaucracy really is. So let's just tackle that first off. Okay, what is a bureaucracy? Well, understand that this is part of the executive branch. So technically, everyone in the federal bureaucracy works for the President of the United States. Not directly, but down the line. So the president is the head of all of this. And what it is it's made up of a large number of departments and agencies, lots of whose names you've seen and whose names you've run into in just random places. The Department of State that I just showed you a picture of is a good example of this. But we also have parts of the government that include the IRS, which is in charge of collecting taxes, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is in charge of enforcing drug laws, the parks, National Park Service, which is in charge of running all of our national parks. These are all parts of the federal bureaucracy. And really what it does is the bureaucracy is made up of people who work to carry out the laws passed by Congress. They all have to be implemented. They all have to have some way of working on the ground. And that's what bureaucracies do. So basically what it is it's all the people who have careers working for the federal government. This would exclude anybody who's elected, but everyone else is pretty much part of the bureaucracy. I mean, it's just sort of like the easy way to think about it. So anyone who works for the federal government and isn't elected, you know, like congressmen are elected and presidents are elected, but unelected people working for the bureaucracy. So what is it they do? Well, like I said, the National Park Service is an example of a bureaucratic agency, okay? They're going to oversee our national parks. They're going to give us tours of historical sites. They're going to make sure that, you know, our tents are in the right campsite. All those kinds of things are going to be done by the National Park Service. But here's some things that just the bureaucracy does. And this is really, really high level kind of general stuff. Number one, they're in charge of writing and enforcing regulations. So it's really the specifics of those things that go on. So if we think about the National Park Service as an example here, okay, the National Park Service is in charge of, you know, maintaining national parks. Well, and if a national park is meant to be preserved as a wildlife area, okay, think of a large one like Yosemite National Park, something like that. What they don't want, one thing they don't want, is excessive trash, okay? So the Federal Park Service, National Park Service, has to figure out how to stop that from happening. One way they could do that is to create fines, but they have to write down regulations saying, you know, hey, you got to put your trash in a trash bin. If you're camping here overnight, then you have to, you know, maybe you have to take your trash with you, you know, outside of the park, or maybe there's a particular place where you can dump your trash. But all of that has to be written down and figured out, and all of it has to be regulated and enforced by the National Park Service. Federal agencies can also issue fines for people or businesses or whatever that break federal law. The Environmental Protection Agency is a big one for issuing fines for businesses that pollute too much, as an example. They also are frequently asked to come and testify before Congress. Usually, if something has gone wrong, Congress will call in members of the bureaucracy and ask them to testify about why things went wrong and how this sort of thing could be prevented in the future. And these bureaucratic agencies work through issue networks and these things called iron triangles, okay? Now, iron triangles are always a difficult concept. So I'm just going to try and walk you through it here. In the simplest form I know how, okay? So a triangle has three sides. And what an iron triangle is an iron triangle is a policy-making avenue. So if we're talking about something like, let's say, agriculture policy, an iron triangle would be strong enough that it would keep everybody else outside of the triangle away from actually deciding what policy about agriculture is. And the reason there's triangle is there are three groups that are involved, okay? Group number one is a federal agency that oversees that area of policy. So for agriculture, it might be the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA. They're going to be making these regulations. They're going to be enforcing fines or whatever. They're going to be doing meat inspections, all those kinds of things. So they're going to be part of the policymaking discussions. The second part of that is going to be congressional committees. So the House Committee on Agriculture, the Senate Committee on Agriculture are going to be part of this policymaking triangle because they're going to be the ones who are going to write the laws. And let's face it, they're going to push agriculture laws out of the Agriculture Committee to the general House floor, where most people that are not in agriculture are going to kind of listen. Most of the congressmen are going to listen to the committee and their party about how to vote because maybe it doesn't affect them very much or it doesn't affect their home district very much. And so they're going to go and vote the way they're kind of instructed to go vote by people who know what's going on and are inside the triangle. All right. The third part of the triangle is interest groups. So these are outside lobbyists that come from that area of policy. So this would be farmers cooperatives, or this would be big agriculture businesses that have created an interest group or something, and they would be advising the congressional agency or the congressional committee and the bureaucratic agency on what type of policy would work well. So really, I think the simplest way to do this is just to remember what the 3 points of an iron triangle are and understand that if they work together, they're going to make policy without too much interference from outside. So the 3 points, once again, are the bureaucratic agency, the congressional committee, and interest groups. So that is an iron triangle. All right, so how can we improve the bureaucracy, or how have we improved the bureaucracy, I guess is the question. So back in the 19th century, one of the most common ways of getting government jobs is through a system of patronage. And under this system, really popularized by Andrew Jackson, people who worked for the presidential campaign, or who were maybe related to the president, or the president knew, they would get these appointed jobs in the federal government. Now, if a president is appointing political supporters to jobs, like the head of the Postal Service and the head of the State Department or whatever, then maybe those people aren't going to be the best qualified. Well, that is really the reason, along with the assassination of a president, why in the late 19th century, Congress set up the merit system. And currently we work under the merit system. So what happens under the merit system is, rather than being hired based on one's support for an incoming president, people are hired into the bureaucracy through a professional civil service hiring process. Okay, it's based on qualifications. They get these jobs through merit, and thus trying to put the most qualified people into the jobs to make the best decisions for the federal bureaucracy. And so what happens is that bureaucrats now are career professionals. So that you have people, you may even be thinking about this, maybe you leave high school and you go to college, and then you decide you want to be in the Central Intelligence Agency, you want to be a CIA agent. Well, you're going to apply to the CIA. You're going to, hopefully you get in, you maybe go through training at Quantico, and you could look forward to 25 or 30 years, 40 years maybe, working for the CIA. That's a career. And it's important to understand that career track, because it does two things. Number one, it gives people increased expertise due to specialization. So as you continue in your career at the CIA, you're going to get more and more specialized, and you're going to get more and more expertise about how the CIA works and what the CIA is doing and all of that. And you're going to live a lifetime of secrecy in the CIA. But the other thing it does is it creates politically neutral agencies. So if you have a career in the CIA for 30 years, let's say, you're going to have that career across 8 different presidents, or at least 8 different presidential terms. So that means at least 4 presidents, but maybe as many as 8. Of course, if an accident happens, it could be more than that, but let's just stick with 8. So what that does is that you, in your job in the CIA, I don't know why I'm sticking on this job thing, but just bear with me. You and your job at the CIA are going to continue doing your thing. And when a new president comes in, they might have completely different political ideas from the previous president, but it's not really going to change the way that you operate at the CIA. And thus your agency becomes largely politically neutral. You're going to focus on doing the CIA's work, and not focus on like, okay, we got a new president, like what were the promises they made on the campaign trail, and what are we going to, there's certainly some of that, but the careers take some of that away. Now, a couple of things that really give power to the federal bureaucracy, and this is where like questions and concerns come up about the power of this unelected branch of government, is through bureaucratic discretion. Okay, and discretion simply means being able to make decisions. And I'm going to talk about this in a second, but it also comes up through rulemaking authority, the ability to make rules. So, oh, I guess I didn't have those. Okay, well, let's go through them individually then. So bureaucratic discretion means that when an agency is carrying out laws, they have certain areas of discretion as to how they can implement laws and also where to implement laws. So sometimes the language that's made up by Congress is a little vague, and bureaucrats can decide what the language means when they're trying to enforce something. For example, let's look at the Internal Revenue Service, okay, the IRS. They go through and they collect taxes from every person who's working in the United States. And they go through those taxes and they look for people who have cheated on their taxes. And those people who are suspected of cheating on their taxes are sent through a process called an audit, which is a really extensive look at a person's finances. Now, obviously, the IRS, if they were going to be completely efficient, if they were going to make sure they're absolutely getting every single dollar that they're supposed to get, they would audit every single worker in the United States every single year. But the reality is they don't have the manpower to do that, nor is it really necessary because a vast majority of the people simply don't cheat on their taxes. So what the IRS then does is they exert discretion, and they decide which people they're going to go through and they're going to investigate and maybe audit. But as they do that, there are also going to be some times where maybe something comes across their desk and, could this be a problem? Maybe. Is this worth an audit? Well, maybe not. And if they look at someone's taxes, maybe they say hey, this person looks like he cheated, but looks like he got $1,000 that he wasn't supposed to get, let's say. But an audit might cost $20,000 to the federal government. So maybe they don't go and audit that person because it's just not worth it. And maybe they do because they don't have bigger cases that they're currently auditing. So they have the discretion to be able to decide how to do things. They also have the ability to make those rules which really are important on the ground floor. So an example of this is the TSA, the Transportation Safety Administration. Okay, these are the people who are working security at our airports to make sure that when we fly on planes that we're safe. And they change their rules on a regular basis. Prior to 9/11, back before 2001, and I certainly know that no one watching this was alive back then, but I certainly remember it. The going through security, which is a much faster and much more simple process. You basically stuck your bags on the conveyor belt, they went through, you walked through a metal detector. If it went off, then they'd have to use the wand on you. But other than that, you were done, right? Then came 9/11 and increased concerns about safety on airlines. Now, when we go through security, we're taking off our belts, we're taking off jackets, we're taking off our shoes, we're taking out our laptops out of our bags. We can only carry containers of liquids, which are certain sizes. You can't carry a drink through security. You have to buy your drink on the other side. There's all kinds of new regulations, and these were made by the TSA in order to allow them to gain more security on airlines. But as you can see here, these regulations really caused a huge slowdown in security lines, and people were getting very frustrated. And so the TSA started implementing programs through their rulemaking authority, like this one, the pre-check, which says, thank you for participating in TSA's expedited screening initiative. As part of this program, you may receive the benefit of no longer removing the following items. So if you're part of this and you've signed up with the pre-check, you don't have to take your shoes off. You don't have to take your 311 compliant bag. I'm not sure what that is, from your carry-on. You don't have to take your laptop out of your bag. You don't have to take off your light jacket. And you don't have to take off your belt. So if you sign up and they kind of pre-check you to make sure that you don't have any background that would be questionable or concerning to the TSA, then you know what? Now you don't have to do as much when you go through security, and it speeds things up, makes people a little bit happier, but still hopefully meets the security needs of the agency. So there are a few agencies that the College Board has specified that you need to be familiar with. And so I'm just going to give you kind of like the one sentence description of each of these. But it might be something just sort of like go back and double check this. I always have my students go through and create a little chart with these so that they know what they are. So the Department of Homeland Security, in charge of just that, the security of the American homeland. You know, this would be immigration. This would be, working airports and things like that. Very large department. Department of Transportation is in charge of, you got it, transportation. These things are labeled pretty well. Departments of Veterans Affairs has to do with policy for our returning veterans with healthcare and things like that. Department of Education is in charge of sort of overseeing the education in the United States, helping out with educational initiatives largely. The Environmental Protection Agency is there to oversee pollution and emissions from corporations and manufacturers and things like that. The Federal Election Commission oversees all kinds of campaign spending and fundraising to make sure that it's done within federal law. And the Securities and Exchange Commission oversees financial transactions with things like the stock market and bonds and those sorts of things to make sure that people aren't using illegal means in order to play with those particular markets. So again, I bring these up here because the College Board does say that you need to be familiar with these. So there you have it. Now, what about checks on the power of the bureaucracy? Well, one big check is oversight hearings. This is when something happens and Congress calls in members of the bureaucracy in order to testify about what happened. Now, usually Congress works on kind of a reactive system, like they react to problems. They don't tend to be proactive with this stuff. But what it is it's a check on the bureaucracy, because when something comes up that is questionable, then Congress can hold these hearings and decide maybe to make a new law or to amend the current law in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. They can also, if you remember from last night, they can withhold funding if there's something really going wrong. All right, so congressional oversight really ensures that laws are being implemented as they're intended to be. So Congress makes those laws, and in the process of lawmaking, there is a certain amount of vagueness that ends up being in laws. And so when you give those somewhat vague laws to the bureaucracy, and then ask the bureaucracy to implement it, bureaucracy will use its discretionary authority and its rulemaking authority in order to make it like really work and really play out. And so this is Congress then looking at how that's been implemented to say, okay, was this what we intended? And if so, great. There are some different methods of oversight. Hearings are the most obvious and the most sort of politically noticeable of all of them. There's also the power of the purse, the ability to withhold funding or increase funding, depending on how bureaucratic agencies are performing. And this also curtails the power of the president, because if the president is, and he is, at the head of the entire executive branch, and thus at the head of the bureaucracy, then presidential implementation of laws can be checked by congressional oversight. The president also has authority over the bureaucracy, mostly because they appoint the department and agency heads. All of the heads of all of the departments and agencies are appointed positions. And as we saw earlier tonight, the president has the power to appoint people to those jobs. So the president theoretically, and this was certainly true of Donald Trump, theoretically puts people who are like-minded with the president and agree with presidential initiatives into those positions of power to try and drive their agencies as best they can. All right. Presidents can also direct the bureaucracy to carry out functions that are in line with their presidential ideology. They can say, hey, as a Department of Transportation, we're going to do this. We're going to focus on bridges because that's really big for me. And in the Department of Homeland Security, here's what we're going to do with immigration, and then they can also go through and monitor compliance. But the problem with presidential monitoring is that anytime that compliance is monitored, anytime that the powers up above try and keep an eye on everything that's going on the ground, it slows down what happens on the ground. Because usually, I mean, let's face it, presidents will have armies of people who can go out and stand in the offices of all of these bureaucrats to watch what they're doing. So it usually involves more paperwork and more meetings and things like that, which kind of slow down the efficiency of the federal bureaucracy itself. So I want to hit a couple takeaways before we finish up here, okay? First of all, understand that there is a power struggle between Congress and the president, not at any particular moment or anything like that, but just in the institutions. Congress and the presidency are at odds because when the presidency takes more power, it necessarily takes it away from Congress. Think if a president starts using executive orders to get things done, that's taking away Congress's lawmaking power. So there is a power struggle between these two. Understand that the presidential power has grown over time, especially over the last 100 years. The power of the president, certainly by necessity, has become more and more, become larger and larger as we've grown from a small regional power that we were, say, in the end of the 19th century, to like one of the two superpowers in the world during the Cold War, and then, now the world superpower. Urgent problems, though, always require swift action. And so when things happen, when a hurricane hits a major city, when a flood hits, anything like that, there's this call for immediate action. We want to have relief sent in. We want to get things done right away. But if you give the executive branch enough power to swiftly react to every single problem, then you start to get concerned over how much power the executive branch actually has. Because the more power we give to the executive branch, which is to be used swiftly, the less power we have in the sort of slow democratic process that's set up in the Constitution. And of course, there are lots of political considerations to how the presidency works and to how the bureaucracy works. So much in government is done based on how the voters are going to respond to things. They're phrased in certain ways, they're carried out in certain ways in order to try and get the best response from the voters, which brings us back to that constitutional principle of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people actually rule. And if we believe that political considerations take the response of the voters into account, then we believe that that popular sovereignty is alive and well. So I know that was a whole lot of stuff, but we're powering through this review here. So tomorrow night, we're going to be hopping on with the judicial branch. So I certainly hope to see you back there. I hope that tonight you got your questions answered about the executive branch and the bureaucracy. And I guess having said that, I'll kick it back to you, Liz.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Make sure you check the links below for more review help. We'll be back tomorrow night, like Paul said, for the judicial branch. So thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow night.